Well, good afternoon. Let's get underway because the buses roll at 5 and 5:30, and we promised to get you out of here before 5 so that you can make that bus back. So I'm with you. My name is Bolla, and I'm here with my colleagues Ed Marks and Diane Wade, and we want to share some of our experiences, failures, successes with going online, going with the web. We are not distance learning per se. One thing about the community that John Mayer was talking about, and many others, who we are, what we are, how we're delivering it. We each have our own anecdotal stories to present, and ours is but one in this giant jigsaw puzzle. From a slightly different spin, as hopefully you'll see in a few moments. The first part of the presentation is what I went through and designing a course specifically to put on the web, not for distance learning. There's as much distance between the book and the eye as there is between what we're doing from our server to wherever students are picking it up. So I didn't do it for the notion of distance learning. I did it for web enhancing for a very particular purpose, which I'll explain. And so the title of this is Principles for Web Course and Design, Part 1, New Course Design, a Pedagogy Looking for a Justifying Theory. And the reason I chose that particular title over the original one, which was Betwixt and Betwen, Asynchronous Learning and the Risky Shift Phenomenon. Now, John Farrago yesterday mentioned that part of his title was A Paranoid's Perspective. Well, if we're going to talk about mental wellness, mine ought to be educational bipolar, because I sort of went through manic, depressive, and it's all a result of CALI, because I went back several years ago from many of these exciting sessions and said, been doing this for 25 years, it's time for something new, and I'm going to put something into place. And a lot of buzzwords are going around 3 or 4 years ago. Safe space. Okay. Collaboration. Okay. Creativity. Okay. Let's get to, tinkering at the margins. One of my colleagues said, now, whatever you're going to do, don't go out there and tinker at the margins. You want to bring it down to the 1Ls. Yeah, I've been teaching that for 25 years. I had a lot of experience with 1Ls, so I'm going to bring this down to them. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the new child twin, hence Betwen. And I'm going to use this as a part of contracts, year-long class. And I'm going to collaborate. I'm going to safe space them. I'm going to do all kinds of things with my students, and they're going to love me even more than they did. Well, it was a failure. Twin was a little clunky, a little slow, but it wasn't Twin's fault. The more I looked at it, I did some cool things. I created chat groups specifically for students. I had the brainy idea, safe space. Eddie, you're not going to have to stand and recite the case. Rather, I'm going to break you down into small groups, and the group will get online, and the group will be called on to present the case. Oh yeah, this was wonderful, except that the results were very dismal. And by the time the evaluations come out, he's a good guy, he knows his stuff, but God, get us away from the computer. And I thought, now why should that be? And so I began to do some soul searching because, we educators, we're also course designers. It's not the sole prerogative of instructional designers to do something for us in a nice package, hand it to us, and then we just sort of run it, and we're the moderators. And I thought, now what is it that I can put into my class and find out why this is not working the way it should be working? So I had to go back to my social science days when I was getting an education degree back in the late 17th century. And something reminded me that, wait a minute, social science research might have an answer to what I was looking for. And I found it, and it's something called the risky shift phenomenon. And in learning, and those that write about it, they talked about the risky shift phenomenon of going from someone who's totally ignorant to someone who is just a little more ignorant, and it's sort of, wait a minute, it's going the wrong direction. We've got to bring it back to someone who's ignorant and going to a learning person, and the rest of it. The bottom line was they concluded that you will not get learners in group environments to take the shift away where the risk is not going to be lowered for them significantly. And so the more I dwelled on it, I said, yeah, that's really the answer to my question. So the next time I do this, I'm going to do myself a favor and build into my courses a few more things that I had learned years earlier and see if that doesn't make a difference in what I was going to do. And so the opportunity presented itself to get away from 1Ls and to do something a little bit different. And what I came up with was an opportunity that presented a lot less risk for myself. Namely, I had to design a course from scratch that would be offered to a very select group of students in any format that I chose to do, but it was only going to be 1 credit hour. But not only that, it was even better because I could design it under the rubric of individual research. So whatever I wanted to do in that design was open. And so I thought, well, now here's my chance. All these years of coming to CALI and listening to all these great ideas, I want to start to put some of them in place. So, learning my lesson from the risky shift phenomenon, I said I got to have an educational theory about this instructional design as I go about this 1-hour class. And let me pause here. I'm a big movie buff, so I could have titled this "What I Have Learned from Watching the Movies." The first thing I remembered Humphrey Bogart in Treasure of the Sierra Madres. He's cornered by the bandits, and he said, "Who are you guys?" And they said, "Oh, we're the Federales." And he said, "Oh yeah, show me your badge." And the bandit says, "Badge? I don't need no stinking badge." Bang, bang, they start shooting. And so most of us in the academy, we talk about learning theories amongst the faculty members. I don't think so. Show me your theory. Theory? I don't need no stinking theory. Bang, bang is the action. And the bang, bang is wholly unsatisfying because what it represents in large part is you choose a casebook. You open up the table of contents, it's sort of pre-packaged for you. You kind of go, well, maybe I won't do this chapter here, and you just sort of work through the materials. And so by and large, when it comes to show me your theory with most of us who are in the academy, we go, we don't need no stinking theory, let's just start shooting. Wait a minute, what is a theory? And remind me why I need it. What's it good for? Well, it does something. It explains something. It helps understanding within a certain domain. And our domain is the learning domain. We are not just solely about 300 footnoted articles. We are about day-to-day activities in the classroom, about this learning kind of environment. And so this is some reason why we should look at some of these learning theories. We don't have to invent them, but they're out there. Others have gone on before us. And what else does it do? Well, it sort of clusters together related concepts. Yeah, okay, that's good. It's linked to rules and acceptable evidence. The behavioralist learning theory says the way you define education is through change. How do you know when you're educated? Show me your education. Well, I can't show you the education, but I can show you that I changed behaviorally. I think different, I act differently. And so that is one evidence, an acceptable evidence under behavioralist theory of a change. Talking about theories, well, it gives us what we do here, special form of discourse. Is this a good thing? Is this bad thing? Distance learning, web-based learning, good, bad? Are we accomplishing the ends that we want to? Two important reasons to use these kinds of social science theories, I think, is it helps us envision new worlds, and that sounds very Star Trekky, very, very much futuristic. But better yet, I think it helps us make things. And I'm in the business of making things. I'm making instruction. I'm designing courses. I'm teaching students. I'm doing all that. So that captures my interest. It helps me make things, and I'm not a very good person when it comes to tools, but if this one will help me, I'll begin to use it. The first thing we have to notice is that theory and practice are somewhat separated. I don't have to be a theorist. I don't have to be a Piaget, who I really thought was a watch. but it turns out to be a guy who wrote a lot about learning theory, and of course he had his supporters and opponents, but I don't have to be that kind of a person. But they are out there and they're reflecting on these problems. I'm more of a practitioner. I take the knowledge and I use it towards a solution if I can. And each of us then can take sort of specialized roles. Professors, teachers, designers, support staff, we all use this kind of theory. And there we are in the faculty lounge talking about this sort of theory. I don't even stinking theory. And you begin to sort of say a few things to attract attention. But then here's what always is the chilling effect in these conversations. Lest we go too far, there's sort of the beware. There is that caution out there, and I like this one the best. When the winds of new paradigms blow and the sands of old paradigms shift, then the structure of educational technology slides toward the sea of Constructobabble. And a lot of the conversation is chilled because we're talking about cognitive domains. We're talking about Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. We're talking about assessments. We're talking about what to most of us in the legal academy constructobabble from another discipline. And we don't quite understand it. We really don't want to take time to learn it either. Well, technology in the educational process, if we can assume for a moment that there is something to be said from the social sciences that will help us do our job better, and we begin to look at technology, we see that it tends to be problem-driven and goal-based. There's nothing wrong with that. We certainly want lawyers that have skills that they can solve problems and they can achieve goals, so this is not a negative. It's just a reflection of what exactly is going on. But the attention is pretty much focused on those achievable objectives. And that's a point that I have to understand if I'm going to design instruction the way that I want it to come out. There are the typical warnings. They could be used wrongly. They could be used in a doctrinaire way. And there are many kinds of road signs there on caution, so we have to be careful of those. The questions to ask, they've been asked for these last 3 days amongst many sessions that I sat in on, are sort of questions I haven't heard for the past couple of years in CALI sessions, because it focuses now on the instruction, on the learning process, and the technology has a good foothold now, but we have to ask questions: what is good instruction and where does it come from? How do you manage it? How do you make it happen? How can technology serve learning? How can you get people to change, grow, adopt new technologies when they should? And how can you tell when they should, in fact, do this? Several years ago, I got involved in a project of learning TQM, Total Quality Management, applying it then to higher education. If it worked in manufacturing, it ought to work anywhere. Why would that be so? Because education under behavioralist theory says it's a process. If it's a process, it can be designed and it can be managed. And like all processes, it has its certain weaknesses and strengths. One of those weaknesses that you have to be careful of in a process is variation. And so we try to apply this to higher education and dealing with the thing that manufacturing deals with, and that's variation. Because anytime you get variation into the process, you know your results are not going to be as predictable, or the quality is not going to be there that it should be. So we begin to ask these questions. And so I began to research about W. Edwards Deming and the TQM movement, and I started studying all the Japanese books on Kaizen, and I started writing articles that no one read, and I started finding myself once again becoming bipolar, manic, depressive, excited and depressed and disappointed. Once again trying to apply this to the learning environment. But going beyond that, I said, okay, let me go back and see whether or not the learning and the teaching is going to be something that I can talk to myself about when I go about one of my roles as an instruction designer. And there are certain metaphors for instruction and for design and for the work we do. One is the classroom metaphor. You know, we're now hearing the sage on the stage. hide on the side. And we heard at the plenary session, the machine and the latrine. They're all nice little phrases that sort of capture for us more constructobabble. And when we term it constructobabble or we see things like this, we tend to hit the off button and say, you know, table of contents is pretty easy to deal with. Product delivery metaphors, well, that's packaged instruction. Maybe you've done some yourself. McGraw-Hill puts them out. A lot of people put out packaged instruction. There's the systems metaphor, inputs, outputs, self-correcting feedbacks, maintenance, things that we've been talking about, showing one another how to do here. There's the processes metaphor. That's sort of the flip side of the system metaphor. And then there's something called the environment metaphor. It's new constructobabble for perhaps what we're talking about as a new something to look at when we design instruction. And the emphasis is on learning, not instruction. This is very bad for professors. They say, what do you mean you're not focusing on me? You're focusing on the students. Don't they get enough attention as it is? But bear with me for a moment. The learning environment metaphor begins to take the underlying views that we have to first look at knowledge in a particular way. That's a choice that we make. One of the things that we put in the little outline is life is full of choices. We have to make some, and we're always making them consciously or unconsciously. But the underlying views of how we see knowledge really influences my instruction design. So I had to spend a little time, not much, a little time reviewing these kinds of things. But the more I reviewed them, the more I ran into new terms, and oh no, there's more constructobabble, and I had to deconstruct the constructobabble so I could understand what was going on. It's time-consuming, but I waded through it. And I finally reduced some of this down to a few statements that I could understand. If I thought of knowledge as a quantity or packet of content waiting to be transmitted, then I began to look at instruction perhaps as a product to be delivered by some type of instructional vehicle, namely moi. And so I took then center stage as the vehicle for delivery, and I'm focusing now on the teaching as opposed to the learning. Well, if I thought of knowledge as, here's some constructive babble, a cognitive knowing state is reflected in a person's skills and concepts, then I might think of instruction as a set of strategies aimed at changing a person's concepts. So now I have to begin to think, well, if that's what I'm trying to achieve, what types of strategies will help me do that? If I saw knowledge as a person's meanings constructed by interaction with one's environment, well, that sounds good. Well, then I might tend to think of instruction as a learning drawing on tools and resources with a rich environment, and hopefully I would be a part of that environment. I still want to be central to that environment, but I've got to be true to my calling, and so the focus is on the learner, not necessarily so much on the teacher. If I saw knowledge as inculturation or adoption of a group's ways of seeing and acting, then I might tend to see instruction as participation in the group's everyday activities. Well, oh no, there it goes, enculturation, constructobabble. Let's do a little more deconstruction of that. Actually, wading through it all, I found for myself that the choice of this metaphor is not a neutral decision. It's actually one that's going to help me in my task. The way we choose to think about knowledge directions our course design criteria. And this isn't a singular selection. It could be multifaceted, certainly. The present choice of theory and metaphor that I centered on for this one-hour course development is something called the Constructivist Learning environment. And to understand that, we have to look and see what a constructivist might be and what the term is. Constructivist theory says that constructivism is not a teaching theory. Okay? It is a theory on learning and knowledge. Now remember, the theory is supposed to help us do something. It's supposed to solve a problem. It derives from principles common to many models, but not consistent with a single model of the learning process. Okay, it's borrowing from lots of different places. And it's borrowing, you ought to be comfortable because you'll see something that you recognize and that you'll like, and you'll say, I've used that before, I can do that. The summary of the principles when you begin to design using the constructivism is that learning involves the active construction of personal conceptual knowledge base by the learner. Now these are important principles, and I've summarized a few that I consider to be most important, getting us away from the constructive babble. And each one can be parsed very closely and very thinly. The active construction of personal conceptual knowledge base by the learner. Learning is reflective and builds on and develops the learner's existing knowledge. Oh, okay, where are they going to get that existing knowledge? Well, it's going to start to come from me because I have an antecedent view of that knowledge base, because whatever I adopt is going to go in my course design. Learning benefits from a multiple view of a subject area. Now, it's very hard to argue with those kinds of precepts. And learning is facilitated by authentic activity relevant to the situations in which it will be applied. Oh boy, what we have now is a little more constructobabble. Bear with me for a moment. For example, if we take and compare the information model, teaching with its central focus amounts to a set of functions. Popular one, the set is orienting, motivating, presenting, clarifying, elaborating, consolidating, and confirming. Things that I think that I do all the time. John, I don't want to be shut out of any one of those kinds of things. To say that I have to do something different might force me to think a little differently about my job. We'll just for a moment consider a software learning environment. We've seen many. And it relates to an asynchronous program form of teaching. The tendency, however, is to separate the information part of the process from the more interactive and supportive elements when we're thinking through this theory that we're going to use. When in reality, the X functions of teaching can be replaced by a set of two, informing and supporting. Supporting incorporates the variety of the others that we just talked about. What we're doing right now in the true constructionist form, following constructive babbleism, is we're going to change the terminology without changing the process. But teaching is going to be defined to the delivery of information and support. So no longer are we focusing in on the teaching aspect, but more on the delivery and more on the learner and what we're going to do to support that learning. In constructivism, or IBL, internet-based learning, is another term that you see, and you have to read the literature carefully to know that they're talking about one and the same. The traditional syllabus is replaced with a study map having navigable interfaces and that preserve context and facilitates reflective learning. We're all familiar with the object-oriented hierarchy. Books have that. You got your chapters, paragraphs, the user interfaces, the contents page, the syllabi, and those kinds of things. This scheme is widely used, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it fosters the view that personal knowledge is either object-oriented or related information having such a structure. In IBL, it's more appropriate design instruction that uses a model without any directional bias that's inherent, as we saw in the object-oriented hierarchy. This is just sort of a little graph, and it's a two-dimensional graph. If we could do it 3D and get the sideways views, we'd see more of those interconnected links. But this does have directional bias to it, and that's one thing that constructivism tells us as a theory in appropriate circumstances should not be used. So we begin to see this study map as the same kind of that we would in a book. So that all the objects correspond to units and links and describe the relationship between them. That's an important part to recognize. And we can add other units as we go along. IBL does not require a hierarchy. Oh my gosh! Anarchy! Informational anarchy. They marched yesterday, taking back the streets. Here we go, we're taking back the streets of our minds. How can this be? Now, if faculty members stayed with me to this point, this is where they hit the off button. How can it not require a hierarchy? Where do I go with this stuff? You've got to give me some kind of map. Well, I think of the map in Hunting the Snark. I don't have time to go there. But this particular map that we just describes a study program that starts at any object and proceeds through any connected objects. There's no assumed learning sequence. Each one is separate and may be a complete course in and of itself. Here is the important point. The learner chooses the sequence. The learner chooses the sequence. It's exploratory learning that is the essential activity in constructivist learning theory. Remember one of the early principles? They have their own personal knowledge database that they construct and then use to solve the problem I give them. Whereas behavioral design of instruction, which is most typical, I give them the knowledge base they are to use. They are to work within the confines of that. And the only exploratory learning might be, oh, here's some supplemental reading. Please read it at your convenience. Again, constructivist learning principle. Learner is active in knowledge construction. They can access databases. They can get it from anywhere. They're not limited. They gain ownership of the process used to develop knowledge or identify a solution. A big point of TQM, Kaizen, all the rest of them, of 10 years of applying this to higher education tells us that you've got to own the process so that you can have significant results come out of it. And constructivism, as a learning theory that I can use, emphasizes that. It anchors tasks to reality. And another important thing is that it tests against alternate views in context. And I'll show you that very quickly in a site in a moment. It also anchors to real-life situations. Real-life situations for law students generally focus not on personal learning goals. This all sounds great, but it focuses on assessment. This is Babble that means nothing more than grades. So that students really want to know, how much of this stuff do I have to read to answer the question to get the grade? You can have all of these supplementary links that you want to. For some interesting thing, click here, read this, read that. They're not going to do it. Time is a precious commodity for them. And they want to know how it is I can get the job done, get my grade. Well, if we're talking about grades in constructivism, we're talking about assessment. Babble also links grades to what is called authentic activity. Now, when you begin to unravel this Babble, it tends to make sense. Internet-based learning is suppressed by a detailed syllabus, yet it can be used effectively for what they're calling authentic assessment. But that authentic assessment comes connected to the exploratory learning. Students have to decide how far to take their learning on the basis of how their work will be assessed, which means I have to decide how their work is going to be assessed. It's why we reported that many learners study strategically with grades in mind. Oh, really? It took that kind of a study to figure that one out? I don't think so, but it did. And that is a concluding statement. So if they're going to study strategically with that in mind, I have got to give them a certain freedom in order to proceed with their work. In an IBL type of course, the assignments are adaptable to this kind of authentic assignment since they're going to decide where they're going to go with it. Written exams are not issued